the most interesting cross between economics and philosophy. What is epistemic pluralism in economics, and how the pluralist approach to scientific research is a really valid one. The main argument developed by Imko's work, and in his own words, is that pluralists argue that there are multiple ways of constructing knowledge, and that we cannot decide on the one best methodology or epistemic principle. In short, pluralistic knowledge is all there is. So Imko is going to present some of his findings, and the lecture today is very based on a paper that he had approved by one very prestigious review journal, and we are expecting to get this paper published, and then we are going to make it public. So once again, Imko, be very welcome here at our institute, at our university, and please, you can begin.
Thank you very much, Monika. Thanks everybody for coming and giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. Just as a quick warning, obviously my Spanish is good enough to order beer, so I'll be speaking in English. I have the tendency to speak very, very quickly, so if I get too quick for you, please throw something at me, or show your hand, and I'll try to slow down. So how much time do I have?
We had agreed on something between 40 or 50 minutes. Okay. I think at 40-50 minutes.
Okay, that gives me more time.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, the presentation I'm doing is basically part of my PhD dissertation, and which I have been working on ever since, and now being published. It's not really published yet. I'm still kind of like going back and forth with the editors on punctuation and stuff like this. So, but it's about to be published hopefully in November. It's a paper on choices and pluralism in economics. So I'm basically trying to kind of like talk you through the main argument of that paper, and also a bit of my PhD thesis, and we'll see where we end up. And I got some things to cover. So we're basically talking about. Before I start, I'll just give you kind of like an idea where I'm from, what we do. Then I do some comments on pluralism in general. What is understood, what's the difference between heterodox economics and pluralist economics, how I define it. Also in my paper, I will then move on to some schools of thought, how they are defined, and then I go straight into my topic, which is choices under epistemic pluralism. I will explain what I mean with epistemic pluralism. Then I'll go on to talk about choices, and then I will hopefully end up with giving you some idea with an example of economics, because most of the talk will be more focused on philosophy of social sciences and sciences in general, but I will kind of like finish off with a nice example from economics. And then I'll kind of like present you my main conclusions. Okay, who are we? My boss once introduced me in the following way, saying that I'm either a philosophizing economist or an economizing philosopher, and I'm not quite sure either what I am, but I'm a trained economist and moved into kind of like philosophy of science and philosophy of economics at the end of my master's, and then obviously in my PhD. I am part of a fairly new pluralist research center at Anglia Ruskin University, and we are a bunch of different academics from different backgrounds. So not only economists, we've got a couple of lawyers in there as well, and people from international business, and we have a wide range of topics we cover and do research on. And if you ever come to Cambridge, UK, you're more than welcome to join us in one of our seminar series, and maybe give yourself a talk. We're always open for new people. So that's us. So that's where I live, basically, in Cambridge at that lovely university, and we have our Pluralist Research Center, where we do kind of like stuff I do, and obviously others, and we're trying to kind of like cultivate this pluralist idea. So what is pluralism? Let's start with that. Pluralism, as generally defined, consists of two parts, or two arguments. First of all, it's the recognition of a plurality or variety of different approaches in economics, and also their promotion of their legitimacy. So it's not only recognition, you also need to say that this is actually what we need and what we want, right? And secondly, rejection, mostly on the methodological level, of a one-size-fits-all approach to research, right? So it's basically saying, like, we can't really do economics research with one methodology only, right? We need a bit more. So Warren Samuels has written that out. Basically, the idea of methodological pluralism rests on the assumption that we don't have a final methodological or epistemological principle we can follow in order to decide, this is good economics and this isn't, to a certain extent. And Bruce Caldwell, earlier than that, in his land-breaking book Beyond Positivism, which kind of introduced the whole argument from philosophy of science into economics and philosophy of economics, summarized the same idea, saying that methodological pluralism rests on the assumption that we have no single methodology or optimal methodology. We can't make the decision, and we have no logical compelling method of appraising a specific theory, right? This is all, it's kind of like born out of the criticism of logical positivism, which kind of rose at the 1960s or 70s in philosophy of science. So he introduced that whole idea into economics and said, like, there's not just one best way we can do economic research, because we don't have any valid methodology to actually say this is the best way to do it, and these things don't work. And so this is kind of like the basic assumption of pluralism, even up to date. We cannot make this decision. Okay. So that brings us to schools of thought. Pluralist as well as heterodox economists always talk about schools of thought. The easiest way to define it is by Ioana Negru, who said that it's a group of scientists or economists who basically have something in common, mostly their interest in what they're working on and so on. The preferred methodology, whatever, So this is also the definition I used myself, and I will build upon, and I will reintroduce that later on when I talk about schools of thought in economics. I kind of like use that and work my way around this. So this is kind of like the idea about schools of thought. It's really hard to define them. Whenever you say this is blah, 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 then we don't really, it's really difficult to say who's actually part of that specific school of thought and who isn't, based upon, their research interest, for example, or their specific methodological ideas and followings and so on. So it's kind of like a bit of a difficult thing to define it. So that's why I kind of like follow the idea that there's a group of people who have something in common. It's the widest possible definition of a school of thought. Okay, in terms of heterodox economics, what is heterodox economics? Tony Lawson basically says it's everybody's heterodox who disagrees with mainstream economic methodology, which he defines as solely focused on mathematical modeling. So if you're against mathematical modeling as sole methodology, you are automatically a heterodox economist. So obviously, there are heterodox economists who do mathematical modeling. So, it's kind of like difficult, but there is a general rejection of heterodox economists of the current, what they call mainstream economics, right? Textbook economics. And similar approaches kind of like always emphasize the idea that there is a deliberate choice in calling oneself heterodox economist. You're not part of the mainstream, you're not doing textbook economics, you're doing something different, whatever it is. And in certain points, it is a rejection of mathematical modeling as well, but not all heterodox economists do that. What's the difference between heterodoxy and pluralism? Well, we said pluralism acknowledges and promotes the legitimacy of basically everything which is going on in economics, and that includes the mainstream as well. So pluralist economists tend to, or some of them tend to say that mainstream economics as we find it today in the textbooks and universities teaching and everything and main research approaches, they do have a legitimacy as well, while there are heterodox economists who say, this is absolutely not working, we should give it up, it's useless, it's not science whatsoever, right? So from a pluralist point of view, we still acknowledge that heterodoxy has a point and should be done, should be taught. If we were pluralist and rejected this idea, then we wouldn't be really pluralist. Okay, so schools of thought. That's basically what we are faced if we look at schools of thought in economics. This is an incomplete list. Haiyong Chang has provided like 8 different ones, I think 8 or 9 in his book Economics: The User's Guide. If you haven't read it, you should. It's really interesting. But basically, we are, standing there and we face different types of schools of thought. Institutional economics, feminist economics, post-Keynesian economics, developmental economics, Austrian economics are usually the most famous ones among heterodox economic schools of thought. There are schools of thought within the mainstream. So, monetarism, for example, or new Keynesianism is kind of considered mainstream by some. And there are plenty of other ones. You can also Marxist economics or whatever you can think of. So these are our schools of thought, and this is kind of like where we start off, and we need to accept that they all have their place in the economics discipline, right? That's the starting point of pluralism, is to say, they all have their legitimacy. We cannot discriminate them. Saying one is better than the other, we are pluralist. And they all live in a world of what I call underdetermining empiricism. So they're not just made up stories about life. There's a strong empirical basis in every of these schools of thought in there. What underdetermining pluralism is, empiricism is, what I will tell you in a minute. But we have this picture where we live with a number of different schools of thought, and we accept them as being valid and legitimate, and we don't discriminate them. However, if we are in such a position that basically everything goes, then we ask ourselves, how do we actually choose to follow one route over the other, right? How do we make choices? If we cannot discriminate between 2 different points of views, how do we choose which one we follow, right? And that's kind of like the idea I had halfway through my PhD thesis when I developed my research question, was about, how do we make actually choices in that kind of environment? And this is also basically part of, or the main question of my research paper. How do we make choices if we face kind of like this pluralism? And this pluralism is not only on the methodological level, it also goes further, in my case, on the epistemic level. And I would argue that we also face a kind of ontological pluralism, but that's a whole different story, so I won't go into that. Okay, So what is epistemic pluralism? Well, we start off with the absence, again, of the final epistemological principle, as Warren Samuels has said. And if we look further into the history of philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn has famously said that there are no neutral algorithms for theory choice. You know, whenever we look for methodologies to make choices, you know, something that tells us this is what we have to do in order to make the right choice, we always end up with some kind of problem when we look at the history of science itself. You know, so there are proposed methodologies of how to choose the best, in his words, paradigm. But if we look actually at the history of science, we come to points where we see that these proposed methodologies don't make sense, right? That's the problem. So he and basically most of the people in philosophy of science come to the conclusion that there is no way we can make a final choice on, you know, theories, methodologies, and paradigms, which is independent, which is independent of the paradigm they are sitting in, right? And to add a bit more flavor, Hilary Putnam summarized that even if we use some kind of data, you know, empirical data we want to use in order to determine whether or not our paradigm is better than something else, the problem is that even the data we use is perceived through the spectacle of our own paradigm, right? So there is no neutral, ahistorical, or atheoretical point of data, type of data or something like this we can use in order to determine what is the best paradigm over the other. That's kind of like the essential idea about paradigms, that they actually tell us what they want us to think and what they want us to consider as important in terms of data, you know, methodological rules, even ethics, right? So we live in that kind of like world where we don't have this situation where we can make a final decision, and we live in some kind of, difficult world, basically. So this kind of brings us to the underdetermining empiricism, which I mentioned before. So it's basically that if we face evidence, empirical evidence, there might be times where we don't have sufficient reasons to determine what we should believe about this evidence, right? What theory is actually correctly interpreting this evidence we see in order to give us a story about how the world is, right? And that gives us a problem. So we can face, with the same type of evidence, we can find different theories. Some of them might be incompatible, and they're all equally good, more or less good at predicting and explaining what's going on in the world. And the existing evidence doesn't allow us to actually choose one over the other, right? So that's kind of like the problem of underdetermining empiricism, what we face all day, or not all day, but sometimes. And so choices among theories and even paradigms might be wholly irrational at some of the conclusions, or might be political motivated. So, and if you want to have a non-humanitarian scientific example, I would give you the example of Ha-Shuk Chang, who is actually the brother of Ha-Young Chang, if you notice. He wrote this really interesting book called Is Water H2O, which gives an example of, in chemistry, showing you how the underlying empiricism could not be the solely basis of why we have the current model of chemistry of water and molecules and etc. as the sole reason, right? So the evidence at that time, there were two different types of theories. One is what we have today, molecular chemistry, and the other one with phlogiston. And he provides really interesting case studies and showing that the evidence, the empirical evidence itself, does not grant the choice of molecular chemistry over phlogiston. There were more things going on, more political things, and so on and so forth, right? So the history of science is kind of like littered with this stuff. So, you know, this is kind of like the world we live in. So I basically say that we have framework-specific epistemic standards, right? Epistemic pluralism basically means that we have different types of epistemic principles which are framework dependent, you know. So framework dependent, these can be schools of thought, these can be wider paradigm group like frameworks, and they tell us what we have as necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, right? So to give you an example of of the standard textbook principles of epistemic principles, we have fallibilism, minimal realism, intersubjective objectivity, and minimal empiricism. Right? So fallibilism basically means that scientific statements need to be fallible. You know, that you need to make statements that can be wrong. Otherwise, you don't have scientific statements. Right? That's kind of like the basic principles we have, and most people agree to them. Minimal realism, there must be a reality out there which is independent of the human subject. Right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we have full access to it, but there needs to be something that we can, you know, encounter and investigate. Intersubjective objectivity is very complicated, but it's basically that statements about reality need to be reproducible. You know, so whenever you make a statement, a scientific statement, you know, do your research and so on, you say something about the world, then someone else needs to be able to come to the same conclusion, right? That's basically it, right? If you don't come to that, then you don't have a scientific statement, right? And the final one, minimal empiricism, subject matter to science must be accessible for experience and observation, right? We cannot make scientific statements about stuff we cannot experience or we cannot observe in a certain way. Kind of links to the minimal realism as well. So these are standard textbook criteria for scientific knowledge, right? There are others, epistemic closure under deduction, for example, which are more debatable whether or not they're necessary. So epistemic closure under deduction basically means that if I know a certain thing about the world and I know that that certain thing implies something else, then the question is, do I know this something else automatically or not? Right? So these are kind of like, you know, fancy words in epistemology, and these are the question is whether or not these are principles, our framework we use, our paradigm or school of thought might actually propose in order for our research to be considered proper research under that framework, right? Okay, so that all be taken in, you know, the existence of different schools of thought, the existence of different methodological approaches, the existence of different epistemological principles, kind of led me to the idea that epistemic pluralism describes a situation where a variety of epistemic principles exist, where different frameworks, different reference frameworks, you know, schools of thought, paradigms, groups, stuff like this, use different sets of these principles and or give different levels of importance to them. You know, so you might think that, okay, I'm not really, one of these principles is actually not as important. We still accept it for our scientific knowledge, but it's not necessary for us to have it. right? And then obviously where there's no persuading, where we don't have a single epistemological principle which allows us to decide which set of these principles we actually need, right? And from that we have so-called pluralistic knowledge emerging from that, because we do use different sets of epistemological principles, therefore we have different types of knowledge. So that's kind of like the whole pluralist thing. The whole argument is based upon. It takes a bit of time, I know, but it's kind of the necessary groundwork to work your way through it. So that brings me to the question of how do we choose between alternatives, right? Back to the question of our schools of thought, how do we choose actually between these alternatives? And that breaks down into, first of all, what are the alternatives? What are schools of thought? And what is choice? And how do we justify choice? These are the three sub-questions I asked myself. So what are alternative schools of thought? Remembering the first definition I gave about groups who have something in common. So I took this, was inspired by this, and then added basically Larry Loden's work to it, which he proposes so-called cognitive aims and methodological norms. And they're straightforward. They basically say if you have a cognitive aim E, you ought to do M, right? If you want to do, I don't know, Marxist economics, then you need to do class analysis. Would be one possible cognitive aim plus methodological norm, right? And I basically said, okay, let's think about schools of thought that way. We have a bunch of these different cognitive aims and methodological norms, and each school of thought has relatively unique sets of these schools of these different sets of aims and norms. There's not just one; there are various different ones, right? So post-Keynesians love uncertainty, Marxists love class, feminists love gender. So there are at least some things where we can specifically identify cognitive aims and methodological norms among schools of thought. However, we can also, and that makes the whole thing a bit more complicated and also shows the difficulty of understanding or specifically separating different schools of thought. There are cognitive aims and methodological norms which are shared among different schools of thought, right? So that's why I say we have a set of different ones. And these can be different, methodological, on the methodological level, epistemological level, ontological level, but we have a bunch of these different sets of cognitive aims and methodological norms, and some of them are so specific that we can use them in order to identify schools of thought. However, different schools of thought might share some of these methodological norms, aims, and so on. So basically, I drew 3 circles, trying to explain what I mean with the different types of layers. Right? So we have non-universal rational processes. The sets of cognitive aims and methodological norms which are non-universal, which are specific to schools of thought. Paradigm-like groups, which is a bit wider, where schools of thought share the similar ones, but we can separate them from other schools of thought. And then the ultimate universal group, which are so universal that we basically take them for granted, and we're not really aware that we have these ideas or these cognitive aims and methodological norms in our head, right? So the outer rhyme, common patterns of hypothetical reasoning, means and analysis, causal analysis, and experimental reasoning are so ingrained in our own thoughts that we don't even debate about them. We don't need to talk about them, right? In my paper, I make a less so serious comparison that if you look at the financial crisis and if you look at the the total output from everybody, independent of school of thought, whether you're mainstream or heterodox, everybody has a lovely explanation of what the financial crisis is, what happens, and so on. But nobody talks about it or disputes that it is an historical event, right? Because it's so ingrained in our conceptual schemes that this is an historical event. There is quite interesting a book by an anthropologist whose name just escapes me. He went to the Amazon jungle and found the Piara Indians. I don't know if you've heard about them, but apparently their language is so interesting and so different from our conceptual schemes that they don't have a concept of history, right? So they kind of like develop this idea that they think back 3 days. I think he says think back 3 days, and after that it's gone, right? They cannot count further than 3, so they say 1, 2, 3, and then many. So this is so ingrained in their conceptual schemes that they don't have a concept of history, or like a concept of history we have, right? So it's important to notice that these are not objective, rational processes, but they're they are universal in the sense that in most cultures around the planet, and specifically in our scientific work, we don't really question this stuff, that it exists, basically, right? Okay, so much about that. Then if you go down to the paradigm-like groupings, this is kind of like where I made the distinction between heterodox and orthodox economics. The orthodoxy is kind of like this mathematical deductive methods, the rationality hypothesis, methodological instrumentalism, individualism, marginalism, equilibrium hypothesis. So if you're in the mainstream, there's little to no criticism of the idea that equilibria exist in the world. Heterodox economists disagree with that. But if you look at them, if you look at textbooks or the research, there might be, different types of analysis, different types of modeling and so on. But, if you do DSGE modeling, then you have equilibrium automatically implied in your model, right? So nobody really discussed this stuff significantly. But you have disagreement among heterodox economists whether equilibria actually exists in the real world or not. And as I said, the final one, Marxist class analysis as a specific non-universal school of thought type of cognitive aim and so on and so forth, right? So once we have an idea about the sets of these different cognitive aims and methodological names on norms on different levels, then choice basically means that you migrate between these different sets of norms and aims, right? So you can migrate between specific non-universal ones, which means that you jump around between different schools of thought. One day you're a feminist, the other day you're an institutionalist. You can easily jump around between the middle layer. It's a bit more complicated. As I said, a lot of heterodox economists are kind of like, not feeling well when they talk about equilibrium. But there's evidence that heterodox economists can publish in mainstream economist journals with mainstream topics, right? So it's not impossible to move between these two sets, right? On one hand, you disagree and you say equilibria don't exist, and then you do research where you imply that equilibria exist. And you need it for your analysis. So it's possible. But the further you go out in the layers, the more difficult it is actually to migrate between these different sets, right? To the point that nobody will actually stop saying or will try to go out of the idea that causality exists. Because if we were to reject the idea of causality for our analysis, because we want to, kind of like move into a different set of cognitive aim there, which disagrees with that, then you will have quite an interesting time thinking about a world which is non-causal, non-causal, which I think I couldn't do it. So, you know. So basically choosing between different schools of thought, choosing basically means, you know, running around between different sets of these aims and norms. It's very easy at the level of schools of thought. It becomes more difficult the further you move out, which also has the advantage that we don't need to necessarily justify or do any choices in the outer layers, because, you know, choosing there wouldn't make sense. So choices essentially are in the middle layer and the central layer. That's where we find most choices, if at all. And how do we justify migration? How do we, you know, we now know that we can choose by migrating through these different things, but why should we do it, right? Here I kind of like introduce the idea of McIntyrean epistemological crises, which is basically a framework justifies itself. You know, why we should do X, Y, and that is framework inherent in the justification, but we might face an issue, a problem, which creates a problem for us we are no longer able to solve with our current, you know, set of theories, you know, our methods and so on. That's usually called, in Kuhnian terms, it's a paradigm crisis. Here it's epistemological crisis. And, you know, we basically face a problem and we really don't know how to solve it. So in order to solve it, we need to discover or invent new concepts or new theories, right? That's basically the only way to properly deal with it is to, according to McIntyre, is to invent new concepts, new theories in order so we can actually solve these problems we face with our current systems. And if we do invent new concepts and theories, then we progress. That is how we define scientific progress, right? Only through these the epistemological crises, when we face someone, and then when we are able to develop new theories and so on, then we solve the crisis, and that means we progress in our scientific work, right? Okay, so we face an epistemological crisis, and sometimes we find significant problems. So ideally, we go on and invent new problems, but there are instances where we successfully avoid dealing with these problems, right? Some people say mainstream economists are down there, right? You know, they put their fingers in their ears and say, okay, you know, our DSGE models work perfectly fine. You know, we just add some, you know, don't know, externalities, and all of a sudden we can, you know, we can explain everything. Yeah, I've been to a conference. Funny quote. I've been to a conference. You know, everybody's like, oh, you know, disequilibria don't exist in the world. You know, all this conceptual criticism of heterodox economists. And there was one mainstream economist in the panel, and he's like, I don't know, what's your problem? You know, you just add a couple of externalities, and our models are fine. You know, so much about that. Okay, so yeah, we try to avoid to become that. We want to solve our problems. However, obviously, the question is, we don't really know when we face a significant epistemological crisis, because there can be instances where we think we cannot answer the crisis, or we face a problem, but after a while we actually do with the apparatus of methods and theories we have at the moment. Right, so it's a short-term crisis. It's not really a crisis, it's a short-term problem, but we can solve it. A real epistemological crisis we cannot solve with the current apparatus of methodologies and theories and so on we have. So, but we never really know what we face at the moment. So, instead of reacting, the simple solution is to try to force these crises whenever we can. Right? And then see what happens. So because we want to, develop our systems and our theories, and we want to become better and everything, we need to actively search and create epistemological crises whenever we can, right? And the best way is to do it via different schools of thought, because different schools of thought are able to create epistemological crises for other schools of thought, because they have different sets of different sets of cognitive aims and methodological norms, and we can use them in order to create certain problems for a school of thought, and then let them deal with that, right? And by doing so, by actively forcing epistemological crises in different schools of thought, having a good conversation, we force them to be inventive, to come up with new concepts, to develop new theories, and so on and so forth, right? The point is to be actively, forcing them to do it, rather than just waiting for, a phenomena to turn up, like the financial crisis. Might happen once in a while, but we don't know when, and then hope for the best. Or the argument is that we actually force it to come. So here's an example of kind of what I think about it, or how I would say what we can do. It's an illustration, it's not perfect, but it's kind of going the way. So I've been looking at the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Have you heard about this? Yes. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. So there is supposed to be a specific level of unemployment at which inflation doesn't increase or decrease, right? Standard textbook stuff. Again, the empirical data is kind of like dodgy on this one, because it's very much related to the Phillips curve. And there are times when the Phillips curve seems to work, and there are times where the Phillips curve doesn't seem to work. So even within the whatever school of thought you look at, I got a couple of them, there is disagreement among these authors whether or not NAIRU actually exists or not, right? Because of the fact that the empirical data shows that sometimes the Phillips curve works and sometimes it doesn't, and it's hard to actually explain what's going on there, under-determining empiricism at work. Okay, so obviously, if you want to talk about NAIRU, the first thing is to accept that it exists. If you don't accept that it exists, then we cannot have a conversation about it. However, different schools of thought in economics have different ways to explain what it actually is, and they also come up with different types of policy recommendations based upon their analysis, right? So we have a bunch of different ones. So I based this selection and this analysis on a paper by Engelbert Stockhammer, post-Keynesian economist. So we can look at a couple of different schools of thought. So we have the monetarist. It's an example paper or book, Bell and Menkyu. So they basically say NAIRU is essentially the natural rate of unemployment, and you can't really do much about it. You can do a little bit of monetary fiscal policy and see what happens. But the natural rate of unemployment is a structural phenomena. So we can't really do anything about it. So yeah, that's basically first of all how they analyze it. How they see that and what they propose in terms of policy recommendations. The next one is New Keynesian, Krugman, kind of like one of them, starting off from the natural rate again, but kind of like talk about labor market conditions, welfare state, maybe blown up a bit. So this can cause short-run disequilibria and therefore inflation changes. So their policy recommendation is get rid of inflexible labor markets, right? Because they are the problem. So deregulate and cut the welfare state, and everything will be fine. And we find our NAIRU, inflation will be stable. Okay, so that's their point of view. Then we have the post-Keynesians, who have a slightly different one. So they look at it at Nauru basically as a policy-induced phenomena, looking at effective demand, how it determines output level and employment levels. Inflation is caused by distributional effects of monetary policies and so on and so forth, right? So a whole set of different interpretation of what is going on, and then obviously the policy recommendation is different. For active fiscal policies, monetary policies, and trying to stabilize an otherwise unstable system. So these guys are saying, the whole system is kind of unstable. Market economies are unstable. So let's try to, do good policies in order to, stabilize it as best as we can. The other basically say, it's stable by nature. Equilibria are everywhere. So don't play around with the policies too much, or you might, screw up a bit. Okay, and finally, our most favorite ones, the Marxists. They actually don't really have a Nauru theory. They do some work on inflation, and they do a lot of work on unemployment, obviously, looking at the labor, how do they call it? The reserve army of labor, and inflation and so on, and unemployment is kind of like this whole kind of like capitalist problem and so on. And they basically say increase wages, give more power, bargaining power to wage labor, and everything will be fine. But they don't really have a Nauru theory, right? Because they don't really work or don't really have developed or play with the Phillips curve. Okay, so these are examples of different schools of thought, what they think about Nauru, where they come from, and what their policy recommendations are. So how do we introduce epistemological crises? So here are some small ones. Obviously, monetarists, new Keynesian, post-Keynesians will argue that Marxists would need to adopt at least a short-run Phillips curve if they want to play with them. If you're a Marxist and you want to join that discussion, you need at least to develop some kind of short-run or need use for short-run Phillips curves in order to explain Nauru. Otherwise, you can't join that discussion they have. Whether or not they will do it is a different question, but that's kind of like something they could bring forward. Let them, here's the problem, solve it, deal with that, right? On the other hand, Marxist policy recommendations have a normative core. As we said, they look very much towards strengthening bargaining power of wage labor, and that can be used to frustrate policy recommendations of others, the monetarist, neo and post-Keynesians, who might lack this normative form. If you remember, actually, I think the neo-Keynesians said something around, get rid of the inflexible labor market, which basically means deregulate, which is opposite to what the Marxists would say. So let them basically clash together and see what they come out with. It's a bit more interesting. Like I said, when you get rid of, when you try to deregulate power, so is it actually what you want for wage labor? To live in a deregulated world or not? It's a normative argument. It's not a methodological, but it's part of the Marxist set of aims and norms, right? So why not throw this at others? Again, they will face it and they will have to deal with that. A bit more interesting in the post-Keynesian policy recommendations because they do care about wage labor a bit. They say, let's use policy recommendations and use policies to create some temporary stability in the system. And most of them, their normativity comes through, egalitarian ends. They want to create a better world. So how can we use radical Marxist normativity here? Well, one answer is to say that apparently any egalitarian end you have is inconsistent with current market-based policies. because market-based policies will always cause some kind of injustice, distributive inequality, and so on and so forth, right? So if you want to propose policies with the background of, trying to make a better world, but you use market-based, policies, that might actually not work. So we can introduce these normative cognitive aims and methodological norms to existing schools of thought, like post-Keynesianism, in order to frustrate them a little bit, and see what happens, right? So either they are forced to strongly consider the unequal power distribution conflict. Marc Lavoie, who is a post-Keynesian / Marxist, already does it. So he's talking actually already about, power differences in markets and so on, and the distributional impact of these things, these policies. And if we face the egalitarian criticism, then post-Keynesians might have to give up these egalitarian ideas, reformulate them, or show that market-based policies can actually serve egalitarian ends. Right? These are two different solutions to that crisis, either to show that this crisis is actually not really a crisis, that you can have egalitarian ends with, can create a better world with market-based economic policies, or not. And then you have to give them up and try something else, right? Come up with something else, at least with your normative ideas. Okay, so everything together. We have no framework independent methodological rules, God, that's a word, for choices among schools of thought, theories, concepts, and so on and so forth. So in the absence of that, I would argue that we should look at epistemological crises in order to frustrate different framework-dependent narratives, whatever the post-Keynesians say, whatever the feminists say, and, throw a little bit of problems in their way and see how they deal with that. And if they can deal with that, they will progress in their research. And if they can't deal with that, then we might be able to say, or ask the question whether it's still worth following this type of research if it doesn't create, or if it doesn't deal with the problems we throw it. We kind of pose them. So basically choice, the justification for choice, for choosing between different frameworks, different schools of thought, different methods, different theories, comes all down to the idea that we need them. We need to make choices in order to frustrate different frameworks, which, if they can be frustrated, then, and if they can deal with that, then they will, make scientific progress. And that's what we need. There's basically no better way to do it, and that is a justification for choice, according to my paper. Okay, here's a long list of all the lovely references I used. I sent Monika a copy, so if you want to have a look at the references I used here, feel free to do it. There's also my paper somewhere in there. It should be published this year, I hope. Who never knows. And okay, so thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't taken too much time, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Imko. I think it's a little bit later for that, but I forgot to formally present our lecture. So Imko is currently a lecturer in economics and international business as I'm sorry, senior.
1st of August, I have been promoted to senior lecturer.
So we are not that young scholars anymore. Our senior lecturer in economics and international business, and the program leader for bachelor's in economics in the Department of Economics and International Business at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, UK, where he mainly teaches economics and political economy of the European Union. He did his bachelor in economics and business studies in Germany, and his master's in economics in New Zealand, before he completed his PhD at Anglia Ruskin University in December 2016. His dissertation, as you can see, explores the philosophical concept of eclecticism to develop as justification for theory, method, a concept of choices under the positivistic assumptions of an absence of a final methodological of epistemic principle to determine such choices in economics. So now that I formally present our lecture, I'm sorry for that. It's a little bit too late. Our discussant had a personal emergency to attend, so I'm going to very quickly make 3 questions as a behalf of comments, and then we are open for questions from you. As you can see, my English is like a little bit shitty. So I hope that this is could be a motivation to you, not being so shy and make your questions. So my first question. Everything that you said and reading you is very fascinating because it's not my main research field, and one can feel as if we are in the backstage or in the very kitchen of our professional work as economists. So it's like being in the backstage of the concert, because we do a lot of the things that we are telling us, but not in a very conscious way. So thank you so much for bring us all of your findings in a very didactical way, because it was really, really didactical. Your presentation comes from something really, really abstract to a much more concrete one as an example. So thank you for that as well. My first question is. It's not actually a question. It's more I would like to ask you for an extended comment on something that you develop a little bit more in your paper, but not in your presentation. And this, I would like to hear an extended comment on the way that our science, the economic science, was treated before McIntyre. Before McIntyre argument, and was treated by researchers dedicated to sink the scientific foundations of our science, mainly before all the pluralist discussion or argument. And I would like to ask a specific comment on the work of Mark Bloch and the attempt of frame the discussion of how we can see progress in economic science, but in the framework much more related to Lakatos' Kuhn paradigm superation, and in somehow this is Mark Bloch's argument. They are very specific in this vocabulary of Lakatos and Kuhn, a way of thinking scientific progress in economics, and another discussion, which is mainly the case developed by McCloskey in rhetoric and economics. So this is my first question, if you can make a broader comment on that. My second question is a more provocative one. In your papers, after doing all the discussion of how to justify choice in immigration of schools of thoughts, and in your papers you conclude that, and it's your words, this paper contributes, the very last slide that you show, this paper contributes to the discussion of pluralism by proposing that objective rules for choices of theories, methods, and concepts cannot be formulated by but instead must be based on intersubjective consensus among participants in scientific discourse. Participants who may come from different frameworks. So my question is, could you please extend your comment, mainly highlighting the main difference, what it will be this intersubjective consensus versus an idea of a less careful eclectic approach or a sloppy mix of concepts originated from different schools of thought. So I'm trying to make a more observed line between what should be this intersubject consensus, which is a result of actively forcing an epistemological crisis, as you said. What is this versus a simple, sloppy, eclectical approach, mix of a whole bunch of ideas that is not that connected? How can we divide and make this line more clear? I think we can start with that and then take your questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I mean with the intersubjective consensus is basically that I begin my paper and my argument by saying that there is no objective rule to determine theory choice, method choice, methodological choice, paradigm choice, and so on. And then I suggest something in order to justify choices, which in itself cannot be an objective rule, because otherwise I would, be inconsistent with my own argument. So the use of epistemological crises is an idea I think is worth pursuing, but I am fully aware that there might be different ways of achieving what I want to achieve, to make choices and justify choices. I'm not aware of them, but there might be different ones. Right? So the idea of intersubjective consensus basically means that this rule I propose, the use of epistemological crises, is not objective. It needs to be agreed upon by everybody. Only if we agree all together, independent of whatever framework we use, different schools of thought, then we can use them together in order to make, choices. But if you disagree with that, then we don't have a basis to, argue about choices. Then we need to find something else. So that's basically the point. Kind of like a cheap excuse to get away with my stuff, saying that I'm not proposing an objective rule here. I'm just saying if we can all agree upon this, then we have something. So the epistemological crisis itself can be formulated as a cognitive aim/methodological norm, as paradigm group like, or even outer layer. If we all agree that causation exists, then we can also maybe all agree that the epistemological crisis is a good thing to use in order to generate progress in economic science. But I'm not claiming that this is an objective or the ultimate or the best possible rule. I'm open to more. So that's basically the idea behind that sentence you expressed. So and that requires discussion and persuasion, which where you might actually argue that the McCloskeyan rhetoric thing comes in, because there's barely a case where you follow a logical argument and are not persuaded by rhetorics, something like this. So yeah, it's difficult, but that's basically the point I'm trying to make. You know, it's not an objective rule I'm suggesting. There's just one possible way to do it, and I need agreement from others in order to make it work. Okay, so much about that. Kuhn-Lakatos blog. I mean, there's certain communalities between all the work of Paul Feyerabend, Thomas Kuhn, Imre Lakatos, McIntyre, and so on. They all build upon each other, and the idea that how does science actually work? Right? They want to know. They want to identify how science work. Right? So Kuhn kind of like wrote first about this and introduced the idea about paradigm changes and paradigm wars and everything. And then Imre Lakatos kind of like came in and built upon that, and they had some interesting discussions. And then Paul Feyerabend came in and took this all apart and actually made quite fun of it, but made a point about this. And the central idea about all of them, I mean, they have different iterations of what they're actually saying, but the central idea is the question of how does scientific research work? How do scientists decide what is actually worth following, or is the theory to follow, right? And what do certain philosophers and scientists propose as the best method of deciding what is science and what is not science? And so the logical positivists had the idea about, X, Y, and Z needs to be, these are the conditions, and if you follow these conditions, then you have scientific theories. If you do not, then you don't have scientific theories. And the case studies of the research, Kuhn did in science, and Lakatos and everybody, they basically provide case studies to show that these proposed rules do not apply in real scientific research. That reasons why people follow certain scientific theories is not because the evidence is the best, or this theory is best supported by evidence, and so on. There are other rules, or there are other things going on. So yeah, that's basically their point. The reason why I use McIntyre is because it's specifically focused on social sciences, while Lakatos and Kuhn have mostly worked on sciences, natural sciences, and I think the paradigm concept has been fairly diluted and been overused since Kuhn introduced it. So Kuhn specifically talked about science, and if you look at his work, I think it's a 3rd volume introduction, he basically says it works perfectly. My idea about paradigms works perfectly in science, but if you look at humanities, social sciences, it doesn't work because there is no agreement whatsoever among the social scientists. While in science, everybody agrees in biology about evolutionary biology. It's the theory. Cosmology, same thing. But if you look in social sciences, and if you look in economics, there is no agreement to the same degree you find in natural sciences, and that's why Kuhn himself basically said, actually paradigm might make not sense in that setting, but it's going to be used anyway. So yeah, and I kind of follow the idea that the paradigm concept itself, I'm not quite sure if it works fully. That's why I use the Laudan thing, cognitive aims and methodological norms to define my schools of thought. I think it works better.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So we are open for questions. Anyone? Sebastian.
How can we avoid bias? In our current world, university, society, and even our families create in us preconceived notions. How to fight these preconceived notions? I get that we should force epistemological crises, but how could we recognize when we are in this cage of thought? And following this question, is it fine to have a cognitive bias to any given school of thought as long as we're open to others by forcing epistemological crises?
First of all, I mean, it depends on what you mean with bias, but I think you can't be unbiased, right? You're always in some way biased through, you know, your education, your background, you know, everything plays in there. So it's really hard to be fully unbiased. I mean, you can try to do your best, but, you know, it's difficult. So I mean, yeah, you can have a preference for a specific school of thought. You know, I'm not arguing against that. And as I said at the beginning, pluralism is basically just recognizing the existence of different schools of thought and promoting their legitimacy. But that doesn't mean that you actually have to, you know, be everything. I don't think it's actually possible, you know, because if you look at the vast work which is done in each and different school of thought, you know, try to get up to date with all the literature in post-Keynesian economics, and then Marxist economics, and then feminist economics. You know, you'll be 90 and you've read half of it. You know, so yeah, you know, it's not a problem to focus on one school of thought. But yeah, if you want to be a pluralist, you basically have to be open that there's other things and that they are legitimate and that they might create epistemological crisis for you, and you should take them serious, I guess. But that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions. Thank you, that was so interesting. The first one, which role plays scientific modeling in epistemic pluralism? With scientific modeling, I refer in a philosophical way, idealizations, the debate on realism and anti-realism, the ontological commitment with the real world, which role plays in a pluralism. Because mainstream and heterodox economics are a model-based scientific knowledge or practice. And the second one is about the question, there are alternatives for mainstream economics. What do you think about behavioral economics that integrates ecological, biological research, evolutionary game theory, criticize the standard rational choice theory, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Modeling in epistemological pluralism. Well, you have to see it from the way that you know, there are epistemological principles which you can use in order to say that, you know, modeling techniques provide you with valid scientific knowledge. You know, so in that sense, it's legitimate to do modeling and you know, come up with statements about the world. I mean, that's basically what you do with it, right? You know, you throw a model, you get some data, you throw it into a model, you pop something out, and then you know, you see whether it kind of like makes sense or not. So the epistemological pluralism behind this is basically saying that, or basically how I would understand it, is that you have, if you look at the mainstream economics, that you have principles which allow you to, you know, justify that these methods, using these methods, actually makes sense. You know, and that's a point where heterodox economists might disagree by rejecting these specific principles. So yeah. Second question was about. What was the second question about again?
the behavioral.
Behavioral economics. Oh yeah, love that. Okay, behavioral economics, game theory. I personally think they are really interesting. The only thing, I'm not too much versed into game theory, to be honest. Last time I've seen someone presenting on game theory, the only thing I actually found a bit difficult is, again, they started from an equilibrium hypothesis, right? So I just asked them, okay, what if there aren't any equilibria? What if you start from disequilibria position? And the guy basically said, like, then my work doesn't work. My model doesn't work. I said, fair enough. Behavioral economics, starts off with a rationality assumption again, and then diverges into what happens actually if you poke holes in that. Again, the question is whether or not they can start without that, from a methodological point of view. Because I'm not a trained psychologist, but I know myself and my friends at least well enough to say that they are everything but rational all the time. But otherwise I think they create some really interesting insights. Behavioral economics, and the different question is all this nudging which is going on, which I have used myself on my students, by the way. It's nothing more fun to nudge your students. But what's the ethical point of view? Should you actually nudge or not? Your choice architecture is kind of like a difficult thing. Sunstein, or whatever his name is, he said it's everything fine. There are no ethical implications in that. But I beg to disagree. I think there are serious implications in whether or not you should actively pursue choice architecture in order to, make people kind of like nudge them into, the right direction. But that's kind of like, that's not a methodological critique. That's basically, that's a normative critique again. So, yeah. But otherwise, great stuff coming out of there. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Link with what you were saying about you can study everything. How hard is it coming to make specialists come and plurally debate about the topics? Because I think your work proposes what the academy is supposed to do, discuss, and it's not happening. They are each in their nest, right?
Yes. The reality looks like this. Heterodox economists and mainstream economists don't talk to each other. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact. If you go to conferences on heterodox economists, Monika and I were at one a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, something like this, they attempt to be open to what is going on, but even there, I think there is a tendency of group think and group building, so everybody is welcome. But if you go into the single individual streams of presentations on, the feminists are among themselves, developmental economics are among themselves, and then you have, whatever. And so, yeah, it's difficult to maintain. And I actually raised that in the final plenary in that conference, saying, don't fall into group behavior, because it's difficult because. If you are bluntly honest, there are some things in heterodox economics I am absolutely not interested in. I find it extremely boring what these people do. Sorry. But, so it's hard to motivate myself to actually, listen to them, engage with them and so on, So Yeah, but that's kind of like the nature of yourself, I would say. You have your interests, and but I think it's at least try to what I'm kind of trying to communicate to everybody. I mean, it's like, but at least try to be open. Listen for like 5 minutes and then decide to. No, it's boring. So.
Okay, so thank you so much for attending, and anything or any detail of the presentation that you are interested in, please write me an mail, and we are going to make it available to you. So thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Vamos a disponibilizar en YouTube la conferencia, entonces también a la brevedad les hago llegar la liga, ¿va? ¿Está bien, no?
That was fun.
I really enjoy it. This recognition, I don't know.